Section 1. The world before Thermopylae. Greece and Persia on the edge of war. The air in the Mediterranean crackled with tension. It was the early 5th century BCE, and two very different worlds were about to collide. On one side stood Greece, a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own government, its own culture, and its own ambitions. On the other side stretched the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen, spanning from the rugged mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the Indus River in the east. The clash between these two civilizations was not inevitable, but it had become unavoidable. The Greeks had tasted Persian wrath before. Only a decade earlier, at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, a smaller Athenian force had stunned the world by defeating King Darius' mighty Persian army. The victory was miraculous, but it was also a warning. Persia would not forgive, and it would not forget. Marathon was only the beginning. Now, the throne of Persia belonged to Xerxes, son of Darius, a man with ambitions as vast as his empire. He commanded millions, and his wealth seemed endless. To him, Greece was nothing more than a troublesome speck on the map, a rebellious region that dared defy imperial authority. Xerxes intended to crush it, not merely for conquest, but for revenge. But Greece was not united. Far from it. A land-divided Greece was a land of rivalries. Athens thrived as a democracy and a naval power, rich from trade and ambitious in its vision of freedom. Sparta, by contrast, was a militarized society ruled by kings, disciplined from birth to death in the art of war. The two cities distrusted each other deeply. Yet, when the shadow of Persia loomed over them both, necessity forged a fragile alliance. Still, suspicion lingered. Many Greek states debated whether it was wiser to resist Persia or submit. To fight meant risking annihilation. To yield meant sacrificing freedom. But for the Spartans, the choice was clear. To live under a foreign king was unthinkable. For them, life without freedom was not life at all. Persia's unstoppable force, meanwhile, in the east, the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen was gathering. Ancient sources claim Xerxes summoned more than 2 million soldiers, a number likely exaggerated, but the truth was still staggering. Tens of thousands marched under banners from every corner of the empire. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, and countless others. Behind them came an armada of ships so vast that, according to legend, the sea itself trembled under their weight. This was no ordinary invasion. It was a demonstration of Persian might, a warning to the world that no rebellion would be tolerated. The sheer scale of it terrified the Greeks. Against this flood of men and ships, what chance did they have? And yet, there was one hope: geography. The narrow gate. The Greek strategists knew that to fight Persia in open battle was suicide. The Persian cavalry and infantry would crush them. Instead, they needed to fight where numbers mattered less, where the terrain itself could become their ally. That place was Thermopylae. Thermopylae, the hot gates, was a narrow pass between steep mountains and the Aegean Sea. At its narrowest point, the path was so tight that only a few men could fight side by side. Here, a small force could hold back a far larger one, at least for a time. And time was everything. If Greece could delay Persia long enough, its people could unite, its cities could prepare, and its fleet could gather strength. Thermopylae would become the stage for one of the most famous last stands in history. The rising storm as Xerxes' massive army began its march across Asia Minor. News spread through Greece like wildfire. Cities quarreled about what to do. Some argued to surrender and save their people from destruction. Others shouted for resistance at any cost. In Sparta, the decision was already made. King Leonidas, one of Sparta's dual monarchs, knew what was at stake. Thermopylae would not only be a battle of soldiers, it would be a battle of wills. Could free men stand against the greatest empire the world had ever known? No one yet knew the answer. But what happened next would change everything. Section 2. Xerxes' Empire. The might of Persia, the earth itself, seemed to bow beneath the Persian king. Xerxes, son of Darius, ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. From his golden throne in Persepolis, he commanded millions. His subjects stretched across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas. His voice, carried by messengers along the royal road, reached lands so distant that many Greeks had never even heard of them. For the Greeks, Persia was more than a rival. It was a colossus. To understand why the Battle of Thermopylae mattered so much, we must first grasp the power of Xerxes' empire. An empire without equal at its height, Persia controlled nearly half the known world. From the Nile Valley of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, Xerxes' banners flew. The empire's territory was so vast that the sun seemed to rise and set within it. It was a kingdom of kingdoms. Egyptians marched alongside Babylonians. Phoenician sailors manned warships. Median cavalry thundered across plains. Indians carried bows taller than a man. To Xerxes, these peoples were not just allies. They were subjects bound by oath, tribute, and fear. The Persians had perfected administration on a scale no one had seen before. Satraps, governors, ruled provinces in the king's name. The royal road stretched for thousands of miles, allowing messages to cross the empire in days instead of months. Gold and silver poured into the king's treasuries from every corner of his realm. This was no fragile union. It was an organized, disciplined machine of conquest. Xerxes the king, but who was the man at its head? Xerxes inherited the throne after his father, Darius, died still dreaming of revenge against Greece. Darius had been humiliated at Marathon, and Xerxes was determined not to repeat his father's failure. He was young, ambitious, and consumed by the idea of conquest. Ancient writers describe him as proud, ruthless, and commanding. When storms destroyed one of his bridges across the Hellespont, he supposedly ordered the sea itself to be whipped as punishment. Whether true or not, the story captures how the Greeks saw him, a king who believed not even nature could resist him. In his court, surrounded by luxury and advisors from every nation, Xerxes planned the greatest invasion the world had ever known. Gathering the storm, the Persian king could summon armies on a scale that defied imagination. Greek historians claimed his force numbered more than 2 million, though modern scholars believe it was closer to a few 100,000. Still, even this reduced number dwarfed anything Greece could field. The army was a tapestry of nations. Persians with wicker shields and short spears. Medes in scale armor. Egyptian infantry armed with long shields and axes. Bactrians from Central Asia with curved swords. Indian archers with bamboo bows. Cavalry units with riders in bronze armor and horses draped in protection. And behind them, the navy. The Persian fleet was a floating city of war, with over 1,000 ships, triremes powered by rowers from Phoenicia, Ionia, and Egypt. Their oars churned the sea like thunder, carrying Xerxes' might across the Aegean. Everywhere the army marched, rivers were drained, fields stripped bare, cities forced to surrender or burn. To the Greeks, it seemed less like a march of men and more like the slow, unstoppable movement of a natural disaster. A god among men for his subjects, Xerxes was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of Persia itself, a living god-king whose authority could not be questioned. His soldiers believed they fought not only for empire, but for eternity, serving the king who represented divine order on earth. This belief gave the Persian army a terrifying unity. It was not a loose coalition, but a force bound by both fear and reverence. Every man knew he carried the will of the king. And yet, for all his might, Xerxes faced one enemy he could not command: time. His massive host moved slowly, consuming resources like fire. To delay it was to weaken it. The Greeks knew this, and they planned to exploit it. The shadow over Greece as news spread of Xerxes' preparations. Panic rippled across the Greek world. Imagine the fear. Reports of entire rivers drunk dry, of armies so vast they blotted out the horizon. How could tiny city-states like Athens, Sparta, or Corinth hoped to stand against such a force. And yet, for some, fear turned into defiance. The bigger the army, the more glorious the resistance. To the Spartans, Persia's numbers meant nothing. To them, courage and discipline outweighed all. But what happened next would bring these two worlds, the greatest empire of its time and a small, divided collection of city-states, into direct collision. The stage was nearly set. Section 3, Sparta and Athens. An uneasy Greek alliance. The Greek world was no stranger to conflict, but usually the enemies were each other. Long before Persia cast its shadow over the Aegean, Athens and Sparta had clashed in a cold rivalry, their values as different as night and day. Now, with Xerxes' vast army marching west, these two powers faced a question that would decide the fate of Greece. Could they set aside their mistrust long enough to stand together? Two cities, two visions. Athens was a city of the sea. Its lifeblood was trade, its strength and navy that carried it across the Aegean. The Athenians prided themselves on democracy, a system where free citizens debated and voted on the affairs of the state. To them, freedom was not simply a word. It was their way of life, and they would rather die than see it stripped away. Sparta was the opposite. Landlocked and austere, it was a city built for war. Every Spartan boy was taken from his family at the age of 7, raised in the brutal agoge training system, taught to endure pain, hunger, and fear. Their society was not democratic, but militaristic, ruled by 2 kings and a council of elders. For Spartans, freedom was not about debate. It was about never bowing to another power. Athens lived for ideas. Sparta lived for discipline, and both saw themselves as guardians of Greece. Mistrust in the air despite their common enemy. Suspicion ran deep. To Athens, the Spartans seemed harsh, closed, and untrustworthy. To Sparta, Athens was reckless, arrogant, and soft. The Persians knew this and tried to exploit it. Envoys from Xerxes traveled from city to city, offering deals: surrender and live, resist and perish. Some Greek states accepted, others hesitated, but Athens and Sparta refused. Still, their refusal did not mean unity. Even as Persian ships assembled, arguments flared. Who would lead the defense? Sparta claimed the right, given its military reputation. Athens countered that its navy was the strongest in Greece and would be essential to survival. Every hour spent arguing was an hour lost while Persia's juggernaut advanced. The Greek Congress in 481 BCE, representatives from more than 30 city-states gathered at Corinth. It was the first real attempt at a united front against Persia. There, amid heated debates, alliances were forged and tested. The Congress decided Sparta would command the land forces, while Athens would take the lead at sea. It was an uneasy compromise, but it was enough. For the first time in history, Greek states agreed to fight as one coalition, not as rivals, but as allies. Even so, cracks remained. Some states refused to commit troops, waiting to see which way the war would swing. Others secretly considered surrender. Unity was fragile, and Xerxes knew it. Fear in Athens for Athens. The Persian threat was especially dire. Only a decade earlier, Darius had burned much of their land. Now his son threatened to wipe the city from existence. Some Athenians argued they should abandon Greece entirely, fleeing to colonies in Italy. Others called for standing and fighting, no matter the cost. Themistocles, one of Athens' most cunning politicians, had a vision. He believed salvation lay not on land, but at sea. He convinced the Athenians to build a massive fleet of triremes, sleek, deadly warships that could outmaneuver the heavier Persian vessels. It was a gamble, but it would soon prove decisive. The Spartan dilemma, meanwhile, in Sparta. The situation was complicated by religion. The invasion coincided with the festival of Carnea, during which it was forbidden for Spartan armies to march. Many Spartans argued that tradition could not be broken, even in the face of Persia. But others, led by King Leonidas, saw the urgency. A small force must march to Thermopylae at once, to delay Xerxes until the rest of Greece could rally. It was here that Leonidas chose his legendary 300. Not the strongest Spartans, but those who already had sons to carry on their names. They were not meant to survive. They were meant to inspire. A fragile unity as Greek forces slowly gathered. The truth was clear. This alliance was not born of love, but of necessity. Athens and Sparta did not trust each other. They did not share the same vision for the future. But both knew that if Persia triumphed, neither would have a future at all. And so, under a banner of uneasy unity, the Greeks prepared for the storm. But what happened next would test that fragile alliance in ways no one could have imagined. Section 4. The Call to Arms. Why Greece chose to resist the drums of war were beating, and across Greece, every village, every port, and every city could hear them. Word spread like wildfire. Xerxes is coming, not just with an army, but with the largest force mankind had ever witnessed. For many, the temptation was simple: submit and survive. Yet, against all odds, a fragile coalition of Greeks decided to resist. Why? The memory of Marathon just a decade earlier. The Athenians had defied Persia at Marathon. They had stared down overwhelming numbers and emerged victorious. That memory was still fresh, carried proudly by veterans who had stood on that blood-soaked plain. Marathon had proven one thing: Persia was not invincible, but also carried a warning. Darius had sworn revenge before his death, and now Xerxes was determined to deliver it. For the Greeks, submission was not simply political, it was personal. Every man, woman, and child knew what was at stake. The price of freedom for Sparta, the decision was rooted in values. To a Spartan, the idea of kneeling before a foreign king was worse than death. Their entire society was built on the belief that honor and courage outweighed life itself. The Spartans fought not for wealth or conquest, but for the survival of their way of life. Athens, though different, shared the same resolve. The Athenians lived by democracy, by the voices of free citizens shaping their destiny. To lose to Persia meant losing that freedom. Their assembly would be silenced, their citizens enslaved. To them, the war was nothing less than a fight for their very identity. Voices of division, and yet, not all Greeks agreed. Envoys from Persia traveled city to city, demanding submission. Many towns surrendered without a fight. Some rulers believed resistance was madness, that Persia's power was too great to oppose. To defy Xerxes was to invite annihilation. But in places like Athens and Sparta, surrender was unthinkable. They would rather burn their cities to the ground than see them fall without a fight. The oracle's warning in Delphi, the oracle gave her cryptic prophecy. To Athens, she warned of fire and ruin, declaring that only the wooden wall would save them. Some Athenians thought this meant building a wooden palisade around the Acropolis. Themistocles, ever cunning, argued otherwise. The wooden wall was their fleet of triremes. The future of Athens lay not on land, but on the sea. For Sparta, the oracle was no less direct. Either a Spartan king would die, or Sparta itself would fall. To Leonidas, there was no question. If his death was required to save Greece, then so be it. Rallying the hoplites in marketplaces and temples, calls to arms rang out. Farmers, potters, blacksmiths, and shepherds set down their tools and took up spear and shield. They were hoplites now, soldiers in phalanx formation, standing shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors. The training was harsh, but the spirit was fierce. Men sharpened their weapons. Women whispered prayers. Children watched as fathers and brothers marched off to war. The air was thick with both fear and pride. The Spartan 300, and then came Leonidas' choice. Bound by religious law and political hesitation, Sparta could not send its full army. But Leonidas would not wait. He selected 300 Spartans, not the youngest or strongest, but the ones who had already fathered sons. These men were chosen not to survive, but to leave behind a legacy. They knew the truth. This was a mission of sacrifice. They would hold the pass at Thermopylae long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare. Their names would echo for centuries, not because they won, but because they refused to bow. The call beyond Sparta, other states answered the call too. Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Arcadians. Thousands of men who could not match Persia in numbers, but whose hearts burned with defiance. They would march together to Thermopylae, a narrow gate where numbers meant little and courage meant everything. The Greeks were not blind to the danger. They knew the odds, knew the size of the enemy that advanced toward them. But for them, resistance was more than survival. It was about proving that free men could stand against tyranny, that courage could outlast fear. The march begins as banners were raised and armor strapped on. The Greek alliance began its march to destiny. Mothers and wives gave their final blessings, knowing many would never return. One Spartan mother is said to have told her son, "Come back with your shield," or on it. There was no room for surrender. Only victory or death. But what happened next, as the Persians advanced closer to the hot gates of Thermopylae, would test this courage in ways Greece could scarcely imagine. Section 5. Leonidas rises. The warrior king of Sparta, the story of Thermopylae cannot be told without Leonidas. His name, etched into stone and legend, still echoes across centuries. Yet behind the myth was a man, a king, a soldier, and ultimately a sacrifice. To understand why he stood at Thermopylae, we must first understand who he was. A Spartan among Spartans, Leonidas was not born to rule. He was the third son of King Anaxandridas II of Sparta, a position that normally carried no hope of kingship. But fate intervened. His elder half-brother Cleomenes rose to the throne, and his other brother, Dorius, perished on a distant campaign. When Cleomenes died without a male heir, Leonidas, once overlooked, became king. Unlike many monarchs, Leonidas had grown up within the harsh Spartanagoge system, enduring the same brutal training as every other boy. He learned to live with hunger, to survive pain, to obey without hesitation, and to fight without fear. This upbringing made him not just a ruler, but a soldier who truly understood the men he would lead. The burden of kingship by the time Xerxes threatened Greece, Leonidas was middle-aged, a seasoned warrior. He had a wife, Queen Gorgo, and children of his own. He was not a reckless youth seeking glory, but a leader weighed down by responsibility. He knew the oracle's prophecy, that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king must die. It was a prophecy he accepted, even embraced. For Leonidas, kingship was not privilege, but duty. And duty in Sparta meant sacrifice. The voice of defiance when Persian envoys came demanding submission. Leonidas' reply was blunt, cold, and immortal, "Molin lave. Come and take them." These two words captured the essence of Sparta. Defiance, even in the face of annihilation. To Leonidas, surrendering arms was never an option. If the Persians wanted Greece, they would have to pay in blood. Choosing the 300 bound by Spartan law and the sacred festival of Carnea, Leonidas could not summon Sparta's full army. The gods, it seemed, had tied his hands. But instead of waiting, Leonidas made a fateful decision. He handpicked 300 Spartans to march with him to Thermopylae. Why 300? And why these men? They were not chosen at random. Leonidas selected only men who had living sons to carry on their names. In essence, he chose men prepared for death. This was no ordinary expedition. It was a mission of sacrifice, a shield thrown into the path of a tidal wave. The human side of the legend, ancient sources tell us of a quiet moment before Leonidas departed. Queen Gorgo, wise and sharp-tongued, asked her husband what she should do while he was away. His answer was simple, almost tender: marry a good man and bear good children. It was a statement heavy with finality. Leonidas knew he was not coming back, and yet there was no despair in his choice, only purpose. The leader at the hot gates, Leonidas, was not the kind of king who commanded from afar. At Thermopylae, he would stand in the front line, spear in hand, shield locked beside his men. His authority was not in a crown, but in the trust his warriors placed in him. To the Greeks who joined him, the Thespians, the Thebans, the Phocians, Leonidas embodied courage. He was the figure who made resistance seem possible. He was proof that even against overwhelming odds, leadership mattered. Why Leonidas matters. Leonidas' story is not simply one of battlefield heroics. It is about the power of choice. He could have waited for the festival to end. He could have delayed. He could have bowed. But instead, he marched, knowing full well it was to his death. This decision transformed Thermopylae from a mere skirmish into legend. Leonidas ensured that even if Greece fell, the story of resistance would burn brighter than any Persian torch. And as the king and his chosen 300 began their march north, villagers along the way must have watched in awe. Ordinary men, clad in bronze and crimson, walking with unshakable calm toward what everyone knew was certain death. But what happened next would prove that Leonidas' sacrifice was not in vain. The Persians were coming, and the hot gates would soon be drenched in blood. Section 6. The Persian Advance. A sea of soldiers and ships, they said the ground shook when the Persians marched. That the horizon vanished beneath a moving wall of men, horses, and banners. That rivers ran dry as the soldiers drank, and fields turned to dust beneath their sandals. Whether these tales are exaggerations or not, one truth remains. Xerxes' advance into Greece was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The great muster when Xerxes set his plan into motion. He summoned forces from every corner of his empire. It was not a Greek army of citizens and farmers, but a machine of conquest made up of nations. Persians formed the core, with their wicker shields and short spears. Medes and Scythians carried bows and daggers, armored in scale and linen. Egyptians marched with long shields and heavy axes. Indians brought tall bamboo bows and brightly colored tunics. Cavalry from Bactria and beyond thundered across the plains, their riders glittering in bronze. War chariots, some drawn by horses, others by fearsome side blades, rattled in formation. Behind them rolled endless carts of supplies, siege engines, and the servants who fed this vast force. Herodotus claimed the army numbered over 2 million. Modern historians doubt this, suggesting a figure closer to 200,000. Yet to the Greeks, the exact number hardly mattered. It was an ocean of men, more than they had ever imagined. Engineering the impossible, the Persian army was not only vast, it was ingenious. To cross into Greece, Xerxes faced the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe. For most kings, this would have been a barrier. For Xerxes, it was a challenge to be conquered. His engineers lashed hundreds of ships side by side, creating 2 floating bridges stretching across the strait. Over these, his army marched in endless columns, bronze flashing in the sun, drums pounding to keep order. It was a sight the world had never witnessed, an empire literally bridging continents. The fleet on the move alongside the army came the fleet. Over 1,000 triremes and transport ships, manned by sailors from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Ionia. Their sails dotted the sea like white wings, their oars cutting the water in rhythm. The fleet carried supplies, reinforcements, and the promise of domination. With Persia's navy at his back, Xerxes could strike from land and sea, overwhelming any resistance. To the Greeks, watching from their coasts and islands, the sight was terrifying. The sea itself seemed conquered. The price of movement, but moving such a massive force was no simple matter. Every step devoured resources. Grain, meat, fish, wine, water. Entire regions were stripped bare just to keep the army moving. Villages emptied, livestock seized, rivers drank dry in a single day. Xerxes' army was both a weapon and a burden. The longer it marched, the harder it was to sustain. This was the weakness the Greeks hoped to exploit. If they could delay Persia long enough, time itself would turn against Xerxes. Tales of terror as the Persian host advanced through Thrace and Macedonia. Stories spread ahead of them. Farmers fled their fields. Fishermen abandoned the sea. Whole towns surrendered without resistance. Greek spies returned with reports of numbers so vast that no one believed them. The earth groaned beneath their march, one said. The sea was hidden by their sails, claimed another. Perhaps these were exaggerations, but they spread fear like wildfire. The shadow falls on Greece by the time Xerxes reached Thessaly. Panic had seized the Greek world. Many states faltered, considering surrender. But the alliance, led by Sparta and Athens, refused to bend. They had chosen Thermopylae as their line in the sand, a place where Persian numbers would count for nothing. And so, as the Persian juggernaut pressed south, the Greeks prepared to make their stand. What happened next would bring two worlds crashing together, the might of an empire against the defiance of free men. Section 7. Choosing Thermopylae. Geography as a weapon in war. Numbers matter, but sometimes the ground matters more. Against Persia's endless host, the Greeks could not hope to win an open battle. Cavalry would smash through their lines. Archers would rain death from afar, and sheer weight of men would crush them. If Greece was to survive, it needed a place where numbers meant nothing. That place was Thermopylae. The Hot Gates, Thermopylae, meaning the Hot Gates, was a narrow pass where mountains pressed against the sea. Sulphurous hot springs bubbled from the earth, giving the pass its name. At its tightest point, the road shrank to a corridor so narrow that only a handful of men could stand shoulder to shoulder. Here, the towering Persian host would be useless. Their cavalry could not charge. Their archers would be forced to fire into a bottleneck. Their numbers, so overwhelming elsewhere, would count for little inside the stone jaws of Thermopylae. It was the perfect trap. Strategy of delay. The Greeks knew they could not destroy Xerxes' army outright. What they could do was delay. Every day the Persians were stalled at Thermopylae. Their army consumed more food, more water, more resources. Every day bought time for Athens to strengthen its navy, for Sparta to mobilize more hoplites, for the Greek alliance to solidify. Thermopylae was not about victory. It was about survival. Building defenses when Leonidas and his allied forces arrived, they began fortifying the pass. An old wall, half in ruins, was rebuilt. Stones were stacked, gaps filled, and barriers raised. Behind this crude fortification, the Greeks would make their stand. To the Spartans, the narrowness of the pass was an ally. Hoplite warfare depended on the phalanx, a wall of shields and spears. In open fields, the phalanx could be outflanked, but at Thermopylae, the mountains and sea protected the flanks. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It would be shield against shield, spear against spear. Naval support, but the defense of Greece would not be fought only on land. Just off the coast of Thermopylae, in the straits of Artemisium, the Greek navy gathered. Athens had brought hundreds of triremes, sleek wooden ships built for speed and ramming. The plan was simple but daring. While Leonidas held the land pass, the fleet would block Persian ships from outflanking the position. Land and sea, side by side, holding the line together. The weight of destiny to the Greeks. Thermopylae was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol. Here, free men would show the world that Persia could be resisted. Here, they would draw a line across which tyranny could not pass. Still, they knew the danger. They knew they were badly outnumbered, that betrayal or misfortune could undo them at any moment. Yet they marched anyway, not with fear, but with resolve. The Hot Gates would decide the future of Greece. Waiting for the storm as Leonidas, 300 Spartans, alongside thousands of allies, positioned themselves at the pass. They looked north. Somewhere beyond the mountains and valleys, the Persian host was coming. The soldiers tightened their grips on spear and shield. They sharpened blades and whispered prayers. The hot springs hissed in the background, as though the earth itself was warning them of the fire to come. They had chosen their ground. Now they would wait. But what happened next, when Xerxes' army finally reached Thermopylae, would shake the ancient world. Section 8. The 300 are chosen. Sparta's finest warriors' history remembers Thermopylae as the stand of the 300 Spartans, but the truth is more complex. Still, the legend of these chosen warriors remains central. Who were they? Why were they selected? And why did they march to certain death under Leonidas' command? Not the strongest, but the father's Leonidas did not choose his best men, nor his youngest. Instead, he chose 300 Spartans who already had living sons. This was no accident. By selecting fathers, Leonidas ensured that each man's family line would continue, even if he never returned. It was a grim practicality. The mission was one of sacrifice. These men were not expected to survive. They were expected to hold the pass long enough for Greece to rally. Leonidas' choice told them the truth plainly. You march to die, so that others may live. The Spartan code, the chosen warriors were bound by the harsh discipline of their city. In Sparta, cowardice was worse than death, and obedience was absolute. From boyhood, they had been molded in the agoge, taught to endure hunger, whipped to strengthen resolve, drilled to fight in perfect unity. Their shields were not just tools of defense. They were symbols of the city itself. A man could lose his helmet or spear, but not his shield, for the shield protected not only the warrior, but the man beside him. It was this code, this unbreakable bond, that made 300 men capable of standing against an empire. Beyond the 300, yet the story of Thermopylae was not only Sparta's. Alongside the 300 were about 7,000 other Greeks. Thespians, who would later fight to the last man. Thebans, reluctantly sent, but present nonetheless. Phocians, tasked with guarding the mountain path. Arcadians, Corinthians, and others, drawn from across the alliance. For them, fighting at Thermopylae was no less dangerous, no less heroic. But history, carried by Spartan pride and later legend, often pushed their names into the shadows. Leonidas' leadership, what set Leonidas apart, was not just his courage, but his ability to inspire. He did not command from behind. He stood among his men. He ate as they ate, marched as they marched, bore the same risks. In camp, he was said to move quietly, checking weapons, offering words of resolve, reminding his men why they fought. To the allies, nervous and divided, Leonidas was a pillar. To the Spartans, he was the embodiment of their code. Marched to destiny as the 300 marched north through the Greek countryside. Villagers and farmers watched them pass. Their crimson cloaks swayed in the wind. Bronze helmets gleamed under the sun. Spears and shields shone like a wall of fire. Many must have whispered in awe. These men walk as if they already know their fate. And in truth, they did. For them, the prophecy of Delphi was clear. A Spartan king must die for Sparta to survive. Leonidas had accepted this burden, and his men had accepted it with him. The calm before the storm at Thermopylae, the Spartans set up camp, rebuilt the ruined wall across the pass, and sharpened their weapons. They were seen combing their long hair, a Spartan ritual before battle. To outsiders, this seemed bizarre. Why worry about appearance before certain death? But to Spartans, it was simple. They prepared their bodies not for life, but for glory. When Persian scouts saw them, they were astonished. These men did not look afraid. They looked ready. The legacy of the 300, though, other Greeks stood with them. The Spartans became the eternal symbol of the battle. Why? Because they embodied resistance against impossible odds. They did not fight to win. They fought to prove that free men could never be broken by fear alone. Their story would echo not only through Greece, but through history itself. But soon, their courage will be tested. Xerxes' endless army was drawing near, and the clash at Thermopylae was about to begin. Section 9. First contact. The opening skirmishes at Thermopylae, the air was heavy with tension. Across the mountains, the Persian host finally appeared, a sea of banners and bronze glinting in the sun. The ground quaked under the rhythm of marching feet, the sound of drums and hooves rolling like thunder. From behind their wall at Thermopylae, the Greeks watched. They were few. The enemy seemed endless. Yet no Spartan flinched, no Athenian trembled, no Thespian broke ranks. The hot gates had become a stage, and the greatest drama of the ancient world was about to unfold. Xerxes' arrogance when Xerxes saw the defenders, he was astonished. How could so few men stand his path? Confident in his numbers, he waited. For 4 days, the Persians camped, expecting the Greeks to flee. But the Greeks did not move. They sharpened spears, combed hair, sang songs. To Xerxes, this seemed madness. To Leonidas, it was strategy. Every day of delay bled Persia's supplies. On the fifth day, Xerxes lost patience. He ordered the Medes and Scythians, elite troops from his empire, to sweep aside the defenders. He thought it would be easy. He was wrong. The clash begins the narrow pass, funneled the Persians into a killing ground. Shoulder to shoulder, the Greek hoplites locked their shields into a solid wall. Behind this wall, their long spears thrust forward like a forest of steel. The Medes charged, shouting war cries. Arrows darkened the sky. But the Spartans and their allies held firm. Their shields absorbed the storm, their discipline unshaken. Then, with a command, the phalanx surged forward, spears piercing flesh, pushing the Persians back. Again and again, the Medes attacked. Again and again, they were thrown back. The narrowness of the pass robbed them of numbers. Only a few men could fight at once, and against the Spartans, that was not enough. The Spartan wall of the Spartans fought with precision. When one man fell, another stepped into his place. Their lines did not break, did not falter. Every movement was drilled from childhood. Shield up, spear forward, strike, withdraw. They fought not as individuals, but as one. The phalanx was more than a formation. It was a living, breathing machine of war. Against it, Persia's vast numbers meant nothing. Arrows like rain frustrated. Xerxes ordered his archers to fire. Thousands of arrows filled the sky, blotting out the sun. One Spartan, when told they would fight in the shade, famously replied, "Then we shall have our battle in the shade." The arrows rained down, clattering against bronze and wood. Many fell, but the line held. And when the archers ceased, the Spartans surged forward again, driving the Persians back into their own dead. The immortals enter humiliated by failure. Xerxes sent in his elite guard. The immortals, 10,000 strong, armored and trained to perfection. If anyone could break the Greeks, it would be them. But in the choke of Thermopylae, the immortals fared no better. The Spartans had longer spears and heavier shields. They used the terrain, pushing the immortals back with disciplined ferocity. By the end of the day, the pass was piled with Persian dead. The immortals had proven mortal indeed. Shock in the Persian camp, Xerxes, watching from his golden throne set on a nearby hill, was furious. He had expected an easy victory. Instead, his best troops had been repelled by a fraction of his enemy's numbers. The Greeks had not only survived the first day, they had humiliated the empire. Word spread through the Persian camp. The Spartans would not break. In the Greek lines, morale soared. They had faced the storm and endured. But they knew this was only the beginning. Xerxes had numbers beyond imagination, and he would not give up so easily. The first blood had been spilled at Thermopylae. The hot gates were holding, but what happened next would push the defenders to their limits. Section 10. The Wall of Shields. Hoplite warfare in action the dawn of the second day at Thermopylae broke over a battlefield already littered with Persian dead. The smell of blood and sweat clung to the narrow pass. Carrion birds circled overhead. Yet the Greeks stood firm, shields locked, spears polished, eyes fixed on the horizon. For them, this day would not be about survival alone. It would be about proving, once again, that courage and discipline could defy an empire. Xerxes' fury humiliated by the previous day's losses. Xerxes was determined to crush the resistance. He ordered fresh waves of troops forward, Assyrians, Egyptians, and countless others drawn from his empire's corners. He believed exhaustion would break the Greeks. Surely, after a full day of combat, their strength must be spent. Surely, sheer numbers must prevail. But he underestimated the Spartan code. The phalanx in motion, the Greek hoplite phalanx, was unlike anything the Persians had faced. Each man's shield overlapped with the next, creating an unbroken wall of bronze. Behind this shield wall, spears thrust forward in perfect rhythm, striking and withdrawing, striking again. When one man fell, another stepped seamlessly into his place. The line did not waver. The line did not break. Persians hurled themselves against it, only to be impaled and shoved back. Archers loosed volley after volley, but the narrow pass trapped them as much as it protected them. The Greeks had turned Thermopylae into a funnel of death. Spartan discipline, what made the Spartans terrifying was not just their skill, but their composure. Ancient accounts tell of Spartans pretending to yawn or combing their hair before battle, mocking the enemy with their calmness. On the second day, they rotated their frontline soldiers with precision, allowing tired men to rest while fresh warriors took their place. To the Persians, it must have seemed as though the Spartans never tired, never bled, never weakened. Persian desperation as the hours dragged on, Persian frustration grew. Xerxes ordered more charges, more arrows, more cavalry attempts. Each failed. The choke point remained impassable. At one point, the Spartans even staged a feigned retreat, pulling back just enough to lure the Persians forward. When the enemy rushed in, the Spartans wheeled around, slamming their shields forward, spears stabbing in a sudden counterattack. The Persians were slaughtered. What Xerxes thought would be a weakness, fatigue, had become a weapon in Leonidas' hands. The battlefield of the dead by sunset, the ground was heaped with bodies. Persian corpses piled high at the wall, the narrow road slick with blood and mud. The cries of the wounded echoed through the pass, mingling with the clash of shields and the roar of men. The Greeks, though weary, stood victorious again. A growing legend news of the stand spread through both camps. To the Persians, fear crept in. If such a small force could resist for 2 days, what awaited them deeper in Greece? To the Greeks, courage grew. These were no longer just men. They were becoming legends in their own time. Yet even as Leonidas' warriors stood triumphant, a shadow loomed. For somewhere among them lurked betrayal. And soon, the secret path through the mountains would be revealed. What happened next would undo everything they had fought for. Section 11. Waves of Battle. How the Greeks held the pass by the third day. Thermopylae had become a furnace of death. The hot gates earned their name not only from sulfurous springs, but from the fire of battle itself. Smoke from Persian funeral pyres mingled with the stench of rotting flesh. The cries of the wounded drifted through the night like ghosts. Yet when dawn came, the Greeks were still there, still holding, still defiant. For Xerxes, this was intolerable. His empire had bent nations to his will, but these few thousand men refused to yield. If brute force could not break them, then he would drown them in wave after wave of men. Relentless charges, the Persians advanced again, this time in greater numbers, surging into the pass like a human tide. Shields clashed, spears thrust, bronze slammed against wicker. The fighting was closer now, bloodier, more desperate. The Greeks fought in rotation, phalanxes sliding back and forth like gears in a great machine. When one line tired, another pressed forward. Even against exhaustion and wounds, their discipline never faltered. Xerxes hurled in more contingents, Scythians, Indians, Bactrians, all the far-flung peoples of his empire. Yet the narrow pass turned their numbers against them. Too many men crowded into too little space. Arrows killed Persians as often as Greeks. Spears pierced through their own ranks in the chaos. The hot gates consumed all. The Spartan machine, what terrified the Persians most was the rhythm. The Spartans did not fight like individuals seeking glory. They moved as one, shield to shield, spear forward, strike, withdraw. Push as a wall, not as men. The sound of bronze clashing, the grunts of exertion, the disciplined war cries. It was relentless. The Persians saw not 300 Spartans, not even 7,000 Greeks, but a wall of death. The mountain of the dead by midday. The pass was clogged with corpses. The Persians tried to drag the bodies away, but new waves of dead only replaced them. Herodotus writes that Xerxes rose 3 times from his throne in shock at what he witnessed. The immortals, sent again into the fray, suffered the same fate as before. Their vaunted reputation shattered against the Greek phalanx. To the Greeks, each fallen Persian was proof of their defiance. To the Persians, each failed charge was a wound to pride. The growing strain still, the Greeks were not invincible. Their arms ached, their throats were dry, their wounds mounting. Even rotating, they were being worn down. The Phocians guarding the mountain path grew uneasy, fearing the Persians would discover it. Leonidas knew their time was limited, but he also knew this. Every hour they held was another victory. Every delay weakened Xerxes' great machine. Courage in the midst of horror, it is said that when Xerxes promised to blot out the sun with arrows, a Spartan laughed. Good, then we will fight in the shade. This was not bravado, but truth. The Spartans fought with grim humor, mocking death even as it pressed closer. Their courage inspired the allies around them. Thespians, Corinthians, and others fought with equal fury, proving that Thermopylae was not Sparta's standalone. Xerxes' frustration by evening, Persia had achieved nothing but loss. Thousands lay dead, their bodies burning on hastily built pyres. Xerxes' throne overlooked a battlefield that mocked him. He had the largest army the world had ever seen, yet it had been stopped by a few thousand men. But even as he fumed, fate was turning against the Greeks. From the shadows of the mountain, treachery was stirring. A single act of betrayal would soon undo everything Leonidas had built. The Greeks had stood against waves of men, against exhaustion, against fear. But what happened next would strike from behind, where no shield could protect them. Section 12. The role of the naval war. Salamis before Salamis, while the hot gates roared with the clash of bronze and blood, another battle unfolded just miles away on the waters of the Aegean. For the Greeks, Thermopylae was never just about the land. If Persia's fleet broke through, the defenders would be outflanked, trapped, and crushed. The fate of Greece was being decided on sea and shore at the same time. The Greek gamble at Artemisium, stationed at Artemisium, off the northern coast of Euboea, the Greek fleet prepared to meet the Persians. Athens had sent the bulk of its navy, sleek triremes with bronze-tipped rams, rowed by citizens who knew their freedom depended on victory. Sparta, though a land power, had also contributed ships joining the alliance. Their mission was simple: hold the Persian navy at bay. If the Persians gained control of the seas, Leonidas and his men would be surrounded, cut off from supply, and retreat. The Persian armada, the Persian fleet, was enormous. Over 1,000 ships, drawn from Phoenicia, Egypt, Ionia, and beyond. Against this, the Greeks had barely 300 triremes. The imbalance was terrifying. Yet the Persians, like their land army, faced a challenge. Numbers meant little in narrow waters. Storms had already battered them, smashing hundreds of ships against rocks before the battles even began. To many Greeks, this seemed like the gods themselves fighting on their side. Clash at sea, the engagements at Artemisium were brutal and chaotic. Unlike the land battle, which was disciplined and ordered, naval warfare was a frenzy of oars, waves, and splintering wood. Greek triremes darted in and out, striking with their bronze rams, breaking Persian hulls. Boarding actions turned ships into floating arenas of hand-to-hand combat. Fire ships were unleashed, drifting into enemy formations, their decks blazing. Though outnumbered, the Greeks fought with cunning. They used the narrow straits to nullify Persia's advantage, just as Leonidas did at Thermopylae. A mirror of Thermopylae, the battle at Artemisium, reflected the struggle at the hot gates. Few against many, narrow ground against vastness, discipline against numbers. Each hour the Greeks held, Persia's vast war machine bled a little more. But Artemisium, like Thermopylae, could not last forever. The Greeks suffered heavy losses. Though they fought bravely, they knew they could not hold indefinitely. A struggle of time, Leonidas fought to delay Persia on land. The navy fought to delay Persia at sea. Together, they bought Greece the one thing it needed most: time. Every day that passed allowed Athens to prepare its defenses, Sparta to rally its hoplites, and a fractured Greek alliance to solidify. Fate converges by the third day. The defenders at Artemisium withdrew southward, preparing for another stand at Salamis. The sea battle was not decisive yet, but it set the stage for the great clash that would one day shatter Xerxes' dreams of conquest. And as the Greek ships sailed away, their sailors glanced toward the coast of Thermopylae. They knew Leonidas was still there, still fighting, still holding. But they also knew, without reinforcements or relief, he could not hold much longer. The two battles were one struggle. The sea and land locked together. And soon, the betrayal Leonidas feared would come, striking not from the front, but from behind. Section 13. Betrayal in the Night. Ephialtes and the secret path. For 2 days, the Greeks had defied an empire. For 2 days, Xerxes had hurled wave after wave into the jaws of Thermopylae, only to see them broken against the wall of shields. His soldiers whispered of Spartan invincibility. His officers feared the humiliation of further failure. Xerxes needed a way around the pass. And then, in the dead of night, betrayal came to his camp. The traitor named Ephialtes, his name was Ephialtes, a Malian by birth. Unlike the Spartans, he was no warrior. He was an opportunist, driven by fear, greed, or perhaps resentment against his fellow Greeks. To Xerxes, he offered what brute force could not achieve, a hidden path through the mountains. This trail, winding over the slopes of Mount Kallidromos, led behind the Greek position. It was guarded by Phocian troops, but lightly. No one had truly believed it could decide the battle. Ephialtes knew better. For his treachery, he expected reward, gold, power, perhaps even a place in the empire. What he earned instead was immortality of another kind. His name forever cursed, remembered not as a man, but as a traitor. The march of the immortals, Xerxes seized the chance. Under cover of darkness, he dispatched his elite guard, the immortals, to follow Ephialtes along the secret path. Silent as shadows, they climbed through the night, their sandals slipping on loose stone, their breath clouding in the chill mountain air. The Phocians guarding the pass were caught off guard. Awakened by the sound of snapping branches and clashing armor, they rushed to meet the Persians. But the immortals, instead of engaging, simply pushed past, continuing down the trail. Their orders were clear: surround the Greeks, and end the defiance at the hot gates once and for all. By dawn, the trap was set. Leonidas learns the truth word reached Leonidas in the early morning. Scouts brought the grim news. The Persians were behind them. The pass was lost. For a moment, silence must have hung over the Spartan camp. The men knew what it meant. They had held the front, crushed every wave, but now they were surrounded. Escape was still possible, but Leonidas chose another path. The king's choice Leonidas called a council. He dismissed many of the allies, sending them away to fight another day. But he and his 300 Spartans would stay. Alongside them, a band of 700 Thespians refused to leave, choosing to die with Sparta rather than live in dishonor. Even some Thebans were forced to remain, though their loyalty was uncertain. For Leonidas, the choice was clear. The oracle had spoken. Sparta would lose a king or fall itself. He would be that sacrifice. His death, and the death of his men, would become the beacon of resistance. A dawn of doom as the sun rose over the mountains. The Spartans prepared for their final stand. They polished their armor, combed their hair, sharpened their spears. To outsiders, it may have seemed absurd, rituals before certain death. But to the Spartans, this was honor. They would die not as broken men, but as warriors ready for glory. The betrayal had sealed their fate. But Leonidas knew something Ephialtes could not. Sometimes, death itself is the greatest weapon. What happened next would echo for centuries. The last stand of the Spartans, the storm of Persian fury, and the king who became a legend. Section 14. The final stand. Leonidas' last charge. The sun rose red over Thermopylae, as if the gods themselves painted the sky in blood. For 2 days, the Greeks had stood unbroken. Now, surrounded on all sides, Leonidas and his men faced their last dawn. The Spartans knew what was coming. There would be no retreat, no survival. Yet instead of fear, they prepared with calm resolve. Armor was polished until it gleamed, crimson cloaks shaken free of dust, long hair carefully combed. To the Spartans, this was not vanity. It was ritual. They were preparing themselves, not for life, but for glory. The Persians advanced from the north. Xerxes' army surged forward once more. From the mountains, the immortals descended, closing the trap. Leonidas' defenders were ringed by an ocean of men. The king's voice rang out, steady, calm, commanding. The Spartans tightened their formation. Beside them stood the Thespians, who had chosen to die rather than abandon the fight. Together, they braced for the storm. The broken spears when the Persians struck, the battle became chaos. The Greeks no longer fought to hold the pass. They fought to kill as many as they could before the end. Their spears splintered against bronze and flesh, until only broken shafts remained. Still they fought on, wielding swords, daggers, even bare hands. The narrow road became a slaughterhouse. Persians fell in heaps, tripping over their own dead, cut down by men who refused to yield. The air was filled with the clang of steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of men fighting not for victory, but for immortality. Leonidas falls in the heart of the melee. Leonidas himself fought like a lion, surrounded, pierced by arrows, battered by blades. He refused to fall until his body was torn apart by sheer weight of enemies. When the Spartan king finally fell, the battle raged around his corpse. The Greeks, maddened with fury, fought to reclaim his body. 3 times they drove the Persians back. 3 times they carried Leonidas' broken form away from enemy hands. To the Spartans, even in death, their king could not be abandoned. The circle of defiance driven back to a small hill near the hot gates. The survivors formed their last circle of shields. Persians swarmed from every side. Arrows darkened the sky. Javelins rained down. Still the Spartans fought, shoulder to shoulder, their crimson cloaks now soaked black with blood. The Thespians stood beside them, refusing to surrender. Together, they made their final stand. At last, when swords shattered and shields splintered, the Greeks fought with fists, teeth, and rocks torn from the ground. No man begged for mercy. No man turned his back. Death in the shade Xerxes, furious at the resistance, ordered his archers to finish it. A storm of arrows filled the sky, blotting out the sun. Beneath this black rain, the last defenders of Thermopylae fell. When silence came, the hill was buried in Persian dead, and in the bodies of Spartans and Thespians who had chosen death over surrender. A king's legacy Leonidas' sacrifice was complete. The prophecy was fulfilled. Sparta had lost its king, but not its freedom. His death, and the defiance of his men, became a legend that would burn brighter than Persian victory. Thermopylae was lost, but the war for Greece was far from over. Section 15. Aftermath. Xerxes and the burning of Athens, the pass of Thermopylae, was silent at last. Where once shields had clashed and spears had struck, now only carrion birds circled above heaps of the dead. Leonidas was gone. His Spartans and their allies lay among the fallen. For Xerxes, the road into central Greece was finally open. But though the Persians had won the ground, they had not broken the spirit of Greece. Xerxes' hollow victory. When Xerxes walked the battlefield, he did not see triumph. He saw the staggering cost of victory. His immortals, his elite soldiers, had been mauled. Tens of thousands of men had fallen to a few thousand Greeks. The pass was choked with corpses, so many that it is said the stench lingered for months. Xerxes had taken Thermopylae, yes, but the defiance of Leonidas had turned the narrow pass into a graveyard of Persian pride. March on Athens with Thermopylae secured, Xerxes advanced deeper into Greece. The Greek army, now in retreat, abandoned central territories. Cities fell one by one. Athens itself, already evacuated, was left empty. When Xerxes' army entered, they found the city nearly deserted. But to punish the Athenians for their defiance, the Persians burned it. Temples and homes were set aflame. The Acropolis, symbol of Athenian pride, was torched. Black smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles around. For a moment, it seemed Persia had achieved its goal. Greece lay open, its greatest city in ashes. The evacuation, yet the Athenians were not destroyed. Guided by the politician Themistocles, they had abandoned their homes before the Persian arrival, boarding their triremes and sailing to safer waters. Their city might burn, but their fleet still lived. This was the true heart of Athens, not its stones, but its people. They had gambled everything on their navy, and the gamble was about to pay off. The psychological blow for Xerxes, burning Athens, was meant to crush Greek morale. Instead, it did the opposite. News of Leonidas stands spread like wildfire, told and retold by survivors and allies. The destruction of Athens became a rallying cry. Greece had been bloodied, but it would not bow. Every city-state now knew the cost of surrender. Thermopylae had shown that resistance, even in defeat, could inspire victory. The shadow of Salamis as Xerxes watched the flames consume Athens, he believed he had broken Greece. But on the waters near the island of Salamis, the Athenian fleet gathered, preparing for a battle that would decide the war. Thermopylae had been a delaying action, a sacrifice. Salamis would be the reckoning. And while the ashes of Athens still smoldered, Greek resolve was hardening. Leonidas had bought them time. Now, with that time, they would strike back. The hot gates had fallen. Athens had burned. But Greece was not finished. Section 16. The message of Thermopylae. Inspiring resistance, though the Persian banners now flew over Thermopylae, the meaning of the battle was far larger than the pass itself. In the hearts of the Greeks, Thermopylae was not remembered as a defeat. It was remembered as proof. Proof that free men, united, could resist the mightiest empire on earth. A symbol of defiance, every Greek city-state heard the story. How a few thousand men had held the pass against hundreds of thousands. How 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians had chosen death over retreat. How Leonidas had fallen, but only after defying Xerxes to the very end. The sacrifice lit a fire in Greek hearts. Farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, men who had never held a spear before, now understood the stakes. Greece was fighting not for land or wealth, but for survival, for freedom itself. The power of martyrdom in Sparta. Leonidas' death was not mourned as tragedy, but celebrated as glory. His name joined a roll of heroes, his sacrifice seen as the ultimate fulfillment of the Spartan code. For generations, Spartan mothers would tell their sons the story of Leonidas, reminding them that true honor lay not in living, but in dying well. In Athens, the legend of Thermopylae carried a different message, that courage, not numbers, was the key to resistance. Themistocles used the story to fuel the determination of his sailors, preparing them for the clash at Salamis. Persian shock even within the Persian army. The stand at Thermopylae left its mark. Soldiers whispered of Spartan bravery. Officers who had once boasted of easy conquest now looked nervously toward the next battle. Xerxes had won the ground, but he had lost the illusion of Persian invincibility. The turning of the tide, the Greeks now had something they had never possessed before: unity of spirit. Rivalries between Athens and Sparta, long and bitter, were momentarily set aside. The stand of Leonidas had shown that only together could they hope to survive. The few against many became the rallying cry of the war. And in the months to come, at Salamis on the sea and Plataea on the land, that cry would become prophecy fulfilled. The eternal lesson, Thermopylae, was not just a battle. It was a message across time. That freedom is worth sacrifice. That courage can outlast numbers. That even in defeat, there can be victory. The pass had been lost, but the war was not over. And thanks to Leonidas and his men, the Greeks now truly believed, that they could win. The fire of resistance had been lit at the hot gates, and it would burn until the empire of Persia itself was forced to retreat. Section 17. Salamis and Plataea. The revenge of Greece, the Persians had taken Thermopylae. They had burned Athens. Xerxes sat upon his throne believing Greece broken. Yet in truth, the war was only beginning. For the flames of Athens and the sacrifice at Thermopylae had forged a new resolve. The Greeks were no longer fighting as scattered city-states. They were fighting as one. The trap at Salamis at sea. The Persian fleet still dwarfed the Greeks. Over 1,000 ships sailed for Xerxes, while the Greeks could muster barely 370. By sheer numbers, it should have been a slaughter. But Themistocles, the cunning Athenian admiral, saw what Xerxes could not. He sent a false message, convincing Xerxes that the Greeks were divided and preparing to flee. Xerxes took the bait, ordering his navy into the narrow straits of Salamis. There, the Persian fleet size became its downfall. The long triremes, packed too tightly, collided with one another. Confusion spread. Greek ships, smaller and faster, rammed and shattered their hulls. Boarding actions turned the waters into killing grounds. Persian soldiers drowned as their ships sank beneath them. From the cliffs above, Xerxes watched in disbelief as his mighty fleet was torn apart. By the end of the day, Persia had lost hundreds of ships. The Greeks, though battered, had won a stunning victory. Thermopylae had delayed Persia. Salamis had crippled it. The last stand on land. Plataea, but Xerxes' army still remained vast. Though he retreated back toward Asia, he left behind a massive force under General Mardonius to finish the conquest of Greece. A year later, at the plains of Plataea, the Greeks assembled once more. This time, it was not a small band of warriors, but a full army. Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, and others united. Facing them were tens of thousands of Persians, heavily armed and determined. The battle was brutal. Spears shattered, shields splintered, cavalry charges smashed into phalanxes. Yet the Greeks held their ground. Spartan discipline and Athenian courage carried the day. When Mardonius himself was slain, the Persian army broke and fled. Plataea ended the invasion. The empire that had stretched across the known world was finally turned back. Greece had survived. The turning of history, the victory at Salamis and Plataea, did more than save Greece. It preserved a culture that would shape the world. The ideas of democracy in Athens, the Spartan code of honor, the flowering of philosophy, art, and science. Had Persia triumphed, history itself might have followed another path. But because of Thermopylae, because of Salamis, because of Plataea, the course of Western civilization remained free. The Persians had come as conquerors. They left humbled. And at the heart of their failure was the lesson first written in blood at the hot gates, that courage and unity can defy even the greatest of empires. Section 18. Could Sparta have won? Strategy, numbers, and possibilities. The Battle of Thermopylae is remembered as one of history's greatest last stands. But the question lingers, could Sparta and its allies actually have won? Or was defeat inevitable from the start? The numbers game at its heart. Thermopylae was a war of mathematics. Xerxes commanded an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from every corner of his empire. Even if Greek sources exaggerated, the Persians still vastly outnumbered the defenders. Leonidas, by contrast, commanded about 7,000 men at the start, dwindling to a final band of 1,000. Even with the terrain advantage, no force so small could hope to hold indefinitely against such a tide. Victory, in the traditional sense, was impossible. But Leonidas never sought victory. He sought delay. The geography advantage, the narrow pass, was Sparta's greatest weapon. There, Persian cavalry was useless, and sheer numbers could not overwhelm the phalanx. Had the battle been fought on open ground, the Greeks would have been crushed in hours. Yet the mountains also held the fatal flaw, the secret path. Without Ephialtes' betrayal, the Persians might have been held for far longer. Could that have tipped the balance? Perhaps, but only if the Greeks had reinforcements ready to exploit the delay. A wider Greek army? Imagine if the full Greek alliance had committed to Thermopylae. Tens of thousands more hoplites could have turned the pass into an impenetrable fortress. With the navy at Artemisium holding strong, Persia might have bled so heavily that Xerxes would be forced to retreat. But Greek politics made this impossible. Many city-states hesitated, fearful of risking everything on one battle. Sparta itself sent only 300, bound by religious festivals and cautious leadership. Unity came later, after Thermopylae, not before. Spartan strengths and weaknesses. Sparta's warriors were unmatched in discipline and courage. In small-scale combat, They were nearly invincible, but they lacked numbers, siegecraft, and flexibility. Sparta excelled at holding ground, but not at winning wars alone. Even if Thermopylae had been a total victory, Persia could regroup, circle by sea, or march through other routes. Without Salamis and Plataea, no Greek stand would have been enough. Alternate history. If Sparta had more time, the most plausible victory scenario is this. Ephialtes never betrays the path. Leonidas holds the pass for weeks. Meanwhile, Themistocles and the fleet decisively crush Persia at Artemisium. The delay forces Xerxes to retreat before winter, with his army bloodied and supplies dwindling. In such a world, Thermopylae might be remembered not as a noble sacrifice, but as the turning point where Persia was defeated outright. The reality, but history, is not made of what-ifs. The truth is, Leonidas never planned to win at Thermopylae. His mission was sacrifice, by delaying Persia, by proving the strength of the Greek phalanx, and by inspiring unity. He achieved more than any victory could have. Sparta could not have won at Thermopylae, but through death, they won something greater, a legend that rallied all of Greece and changed the course of history. Section 19, Legacy. How Thermopylae echoed. Through history, Thermopylae was more than a battle. It was a story, a symbol, a lesson carved into history with blood and bronze. Though Leonidas and his men fell, their sacrifice echoed far beyond the mountains of Greece, shaping not just their own time, but generations to come. The Greek memory in the years after the Persian Wars, Thermopylae became a rallying point for Greek pride. Sparta enshrined the names of the fallen. A monument was raised on the battlefield, carved with a simple epitaph. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. For Greeks, this was not mourning. It was inspiration. To die for freedom was the highest honor. Thermopylae became the eternal example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Sparta's glory and burden for Sparta. Thermopylae became both a badge of honor and a weight of expectation. The legend of Leonidas and the 300 defined the Spartan identity for centuries. Every boy raised in the Agode was reminded that his duty was not to live, but to serve, fight, and if necessary, die for the state. Yet the shadow of Thermopylae also bound Sparta. Their rigid focus on military virtue left them slow to adapt, even as the world around them changed. Glory at Thermopylae would one day give way to decline in the wars that followed. Athens and the idea of freedom for Athens. The message was different. Thermopylae showed that numbers and power could be resisted by courage and cunning. That same spirit infused Athens' navy at Salamis and inspired its later role as the school of Hellas. The story of the Spartans' sacrifice became part of Athenian oratory, used to remind citizens of the cost of freedom and the need for unity. Beyond Greece, Thermopylae's legacy spread far beyond the ancient world. Centuries later, Romans compared their own battles to the Spartan stand. Medieval knights, fighting against invasions, invoked Thermopylae as a symbol of noble sacrifice. In modern times, from the defenders of the Alamo to soldiers in the world wars, the phrase "another Thermopylae" has been used to describe small forces standing against overwhelming odds. The story became universal, a reminder that courage can matter more than numbers. The eternal lesson: Thermopylae endures not because it was a victory, but because it was a defeat that became greater than victory. It showed that sometimes the act of resistance itself can change history. Leonidas' choice, and the choice of his men, ensured that Greece stood united long enough to preserve its freedom. And from that freedom grew ideas of democracy, philosophy, and art that shaped the world we live in today. The hot gates were not just a pass in the mountains. They were the gates of history, and beyond them lay the future of the West. Section 20. Conclusion. Thermopylae and the power of sacrifice. The smoke of battle has long since vanished from Thermopylae. The mountains stand silent, the hot springs still flow, and the pass has widened with time. But though the battlefield itself has changed, the story remains immortal. Thermopylae was not a victory. It was not even a stalemate. It was a deliberate sacrifice, a stand made by Leonidas and his men to buy time, to send a message, to prove that freedom could be defended even in the face of certain death. The power of choice Leonidas could have retreated. He could have saved his men, preserved his strength, but he chose another path. By staying, by dying, he turned a hopeless defense into a legend. His choice carried more weight than 1,000 victories. The Spartans and their allies showed the world that the measure of courage is not whether one survives, but whether one dares to resist. That lesson carried through Salamis, Plataea, and into the centuries beyond. Why Thermopylae endures, history remembers many battles, some greater in scale, some bloodier in outcome. Yet few resonate like Thermopylae. It endures because it is a story about the human spirit, about standing against impossible odds with nothing but will, discipline, and honor. Every generation finds its own Thermopylae, its own moment when the few must face the many, when courage is tested against fear. And every generation returns to Leonidas, the 300, and their allies to remember that sometimes sacrifice itself is victory. The echo across time, when we speak of Thermopylae, we do not think of Xerxes' triumph. We think of the men who refused to bow. We think of a king who chose death so that his people might live. We think of a narrow pass where the fate of nations turned on the courage of a few. The hot gates became more than a battlefield. They became a symbol, and symbols never die. Final thought, could Sparta have won? Perhaps not on the field, but in the story of history, in the memory of mankind, Leonidas and his Spartans achieved a victory greater than conquest. They proved that courage, unity, and sacrifice can defy even the mightiest empire. And that, in the end, is why Thermopylae will never be forgotten.